let's talk more about the attack on free speech, which is inevitably coming. Well, it's already happening with people being arrested just for posting tweets which later turn out not to be true. We're going to arrest everyone who does that. Well, we're going to have to build a heck of a lot more prisons. Well, let's talk about this right now with Tom Slater, who's editor of Spiked Online and joins us now. Good morning to you, Tom.
Morning, Julia.
Thanks so much for joining us. I have to say, I mean, look, watching this from afar for the last week, I was just absolutely horrified to see what has been happening, not just what's happening on our streets, but what is also happening online. I think you and I would both agree. If you are inciting violence, you're urging people to go and burn down a hotel with migrants in it, you are, organising to sort of people to get violent protests outside a mosque or let's go and give the police a kicking in this particular street tomorrow night. Yeah. I've got no problem with the full force of the law coming down on those people, and I'm sure you don't. When it comes to people simply passing on information they believe at the time to be true, but later turns out not to be true, should those people be facing 2-3 years in prison?
I think it sets a really alarming precedent. I mean, I have no sympathy, or at least I certainly have no support for the people who were sharing that misinformation in those early days. I mean, it was obvious to anyone that this had come out of absolutely nowhere. At the same time, I don't think the law is how this sort of speech should be dealt with. We would be opening Pandora's box if we got into a situation where you had the police arresting and the CPS prosecuting people for sharing misleading information, because you then got the state effectively having to be a sort of ministry of truth, having to keep track on a kind of live basis as to what people are saying and working out if it meets a criminal threshold, taking us into very alarming new territory. I think in combination with everything else that we've seen, we're seeing a government thinking in response to violent racist riots that the problem is freedom of speech. Yeah. This is a reflex governments often have, but I think it will not do anything to tamp down on some of the attitudes we've seen expressed in recent days. It certainly won't get a high handle on the rioting itself, which thankfully is in remission at this point. And also, I think it's just missing the broader problem. Censorship can often be like a displacement activity, I think, for the state. And I dare say that's what we're stumbling into at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this is the sort of reaction I would expect from Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or Kim Jong-un, not from a democratically elected, supposedly progressive, I mean, inverted commas, government. Although, again, I don't think Labour are necessarily any worse than the last Tory government on this issue. They've, a lot of that stuff has had to be fought against under the last 14 years of the Tories as well. But this is the extraordinary thing. Even when David Amess, a Tory MP, was murdered, we don't hear much about him because it's all been about Jo Cox. Both equally horrific murders by political extremists. But one matters more than the other because of the political extremist views. But when David Amess was murdered, the debate suddenly became about online violence and threats and MPs getting threats. And it's like, but it's all about what was going on online as opposed to what happens in real life. There are a lot of people who talk a good game online. I've had plenty of those people dealing with me online over the years. I don't think most of them, the vast majority, would actually, follow through. They're like, you shouldn't be allowed to threaten people. You shouldn't be inciting violence. But those things are already against the law. And rather usefully, when someone puts it in a tweet rather than says it to somebody in person, you've got a record of it. And people have been prosecuted for that. But what the government is talking about, this is online censorship, is, again, moving into this territory where something can still be legal. We go back to that old phrase, legal but harmful content. This idea that they get, as you say, they get to decide what isn't harmful and is or isn't true. Now, we've had this with, we had this with the BLM riots, didn't we? We had this when people were pointing out the realities behind those riots. We've had this with lockdown, with mask mandates, with vaccine and some blatant lies about the vaccine being told by senior figures in government and scientists and medics and the like. There doesn't seem to be any comeuppance for those people, though.
I think that's always the concern, isn't it? Is that what flavour of misinformation, what flavour of disinformation, even what flavour of hate speech are you more concerned about? Everyone incredibly partial on these things. There is such a thing as the truth, but it's always quite difficult to get at sometimes. People say things which turn out later not to be true. Sometimes people are ridiculed for saying something which later turns out to be absolutely true and 100% correct. This is why you don't get the state or social media companies to decide what fake news is and clamp down on it, to decide what hatred is and clamp down on it. That's something that collectively as a society, in a kind of form of public discussion, we work out what we believe is right and what we believe is true.
Yeah.
The problem that the government is stumbling into now is thinking that anyone has that power to decide. And I think by reviving the legal but harmful clause of the original Online Safety Bill Now Act, which was taken out, and now there's seemingly a lot of desire to put it back in by the Labour government. Another particularly sinister thing about that is that it's one thing if the government wants to say we're going to criminalise this form of speech. I would oppose that. I'm free speech absolutist, but still, there's a kind of democratic legitimacy to doing so to a certain extent, one could say. At least you could repeal that law. This is basically saying to the social media companies, within a kind of vague set of guidelines, we would like you to decide what speech it is that is harmful and therefore should be clamped down upon. It becomes kind of outsourcing state censorship to the private sector and to companies which are even less accountable than elected on a very slim majority. So that's a particularly concerning aspect of this, which is it's not just censorship, which is always bad, but it's also kind of the state and the private sector working sort of hand in glove and empowering Silicon Valley to make these decisions on behalf of politicians.
Yeah, and the extraordinary thing is that those on the sort of progressive left, again, I voted commas around all of that, and the Labour Party, Liberals, and all so-called Liberals, they're horrified by Elon Musk and his views, and they how outrageous this billionaire gets to decide what people can and can't say online. They're perfectly relaxed with Zuckerberg doing it with Facebook and everything else, or Insta and whatever else he owns back in California. Everyone picks and chooses. Now, I'm not as much of a free speech absolutist as you are. But I'm a hell of a long of the way there to, very, very close to your views. In that view, I don't want any billionaire or any government getting to decide what I can say or what anyone else can say, whether I agree with them or disagree with them. I am in no way threatened by Andrew Tate saying something online or by Stephen Yaxley Lennon, a.k.a. Trump Robinson, saying online that's untrue, because we can challenge it. When we see it, we can challenge it. The way you defeat bad ideas is with good ideas. When people tweet information that's incorrect, you can correct it. That's how you tackle bad ideas. Censorship absolutely has never been proven to work to actually tackle bad ideas. Censorship works only as a way of protecting the person or the government, the organisation doing the censorship.
I couldn't agree more, and I think it's depressing that argument has been lost in this discussion. If we want to, and I think we should want to, take on the disgusting bigotry and racism that we've seen expressed online and off
100%.
in recent days, recognise free speech as our best weapon in that. This is something that the US civil rights movement always used to say. The early gay rights movement referred to free speech as their greatest weapon against prejudice, because by definition, it's the groups who are marginalised in society who are going to be most likely to be targeted by repressive laws rather than anyone else. So I think we need to kind of regain our faith in freedom of speech as a way of battling untruths. And we also need to recognise the role that censorship has already played in emboldening the handful of far-right and hard-right agitators that we have when they were kicked off of social media platforms en masse, when they were kind of, in some cases, arrested just for expressing disgusting, but nevertheless just expressing views. They were given the status of martyrs, they were given the status of truth tellers, even though a lot of these people lie every day of the week on the internet. And so I think getting back to a position where freedom of speech is seen as a fundamental thing and also a fundamental way in which to target and tackle the attitudes and the trends that we dislike, the much healthier space that we'll be in, I think.
Absolutely. Hear to that. I think it's going to be a very tough fight over the next 5 years, and I don't even think it gets any better even when Labour government is ousted on this, Tom. Tom Slater, editor of Spiked Online, thank you very much.